Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe from multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines and many other sectors.
Hello and welcome to Easynomics. I am Siddharth Zarabi. What are Indians spending their money on? As incomes go up, as our growth goes up, as more jobs are created, obviously spending goes up. But where is that money being spent? On what items? What is the difference between India and Bharat when it comes to that kind of spending? And what are therefore the consequences of growth, inequality and poverty? Some of these questions have been answered as much as is possible with macro data in the latest survey that has been conducted by our official statistics setup, and that survey has pointed out several interesting conclusions. But before we go to what those key highlights and survey findings are, I want to introduce today's guests on Easynomics. Saugata Bhattacharya, one of the most well-known senior economists in India, commentator on economic and economic policy issues. We're also joined by Siddhartha Sanyal, the chief economist and head of research at Bandhan Bank. Welcome to the show. It was a Sunday release of data. The government and the Niti Aayog has put out a headline claim, which has been all over the media. I'll start with you, Saugata, to ask you to explain to our viewers what is this survey and why is it so significant? Why are all of us debating this?
So thank you, Siddharth, for having me on your show once again. Two or three things that is very, very critical about this survey. One, on the growth side, remember the GDP data that we normally use to measure growth, to understand growth, does not have a separate rural and urban distinction. This survey, in fact, other expenditure surveys that were held before and other consumer expenditure surveys distinguishes between urban and rural. So this is the first very important thing, which gives you an idea. Because remember, I mean, there's been a huge amount of vague narrative about weakness in rural growth, etc. Number two, which is very, very important, not just from a growth perspective, but also from a policy perspective, is that the periodic, typically it used to be every 5 years. This period has been lengthened a little bit. So the CPI basket on which the various commodities that go into the inflation index, the consumer inflation index, is sourced from these consumption surveys. And remember that CPI is of critical importance in the setting of monetary policy, setting interest rates, which is a big guiding factor in the growth dynamics. So these are the two critical important issues on the broad macroeconomic sense. Third, more important, is the distinction between the various categories of consumption, as you very correctly pointed out in your opening statement. This enables us to understand in far more granular detail how consumption in the rural and urban areas are progressing, and how, given the real and the nominal growth, how do we interpret this in terms of the relative inflation basket. So these are the three critical important areas for in which the MPCE numbers need to be seen.
Siddharth, coming to you, why is this such a big deal? Because, there are several interesting nuggets, but we'll come to that. Is it indeed a big deal according to you?
Oh, of course. I think Saugata explained it very nicely. I would like to add that even in our overall GDP or the overall economic activities, private final consumption expenditure is about 65% of the overall economic activities. So this is by far the biggest constituent. And another important factor is that while for the last so many, not so many years, last so many few decades, we have seen that India's GDP is not only high, it's high with a fair degree of stability more often than not. I think a lot of that actually emanate from this particular factor that India's consumption, private final consumption expenditure is roughly two-thirds of the overall economic activity, and still today, it's to a great extent, it's not luxury consumption. It's more necessary consumption. I'll not call it basic consumption, but it's more often than not more of a necessity consumption rather than luxury consumption. That means as income levels go higher, as job creation keeps on happening, as people move on to higher income and per capita income bucket, they keep on spending more and more on some of the virtuous consumption part, and that becomes some kind of plowing back into the economy. And that's why you typically get to see an economy with a stable and high GDP growth more often than not. I think thus understanding the private final consumption expenditure part is of absolute importance, very critical for us, apart from all
Okay,
the points that you had articulated so well.
absolutely. And let's now sort of dip into the headline points. One of them, Shogato, is that household spending has doubled in the past decade. And the second point that I would like to attach to that is strong rural consumption is outpacing urban spends. Siddharth also spoke about, that much of the consumption is at the mass level. It is necessity linked, not luxury, but essentials. What does this tell us? Does it tell us that Bharat is not as weak in economic terms that we tend to believe? Because there is another bit of data which says that most of the job creation and economic activity is happening in urban India. Shogato.
So, I mean, very interesting question and very interesting data relating to this. You're absolutely right. Number one, that growth, particularly in the rural area, consumption growth in the rural area has been much more, seems to have been much more robust than is typically discussed by various FMCG companies, other companies, in terms of their sales, etc., and which has been a pervasive. This seems to be a different narrative that has come up. Secondly, the more important part is that relative to the previous consumption surveys, the difference between the rural and urban per capita consumption expenditure, what is called the MPCE in this monthly per capita consumption expenditure, is in 2022-23 the lowest ever in the last four surveys that have been reflected. 71%. The difference in terms of rural expenditure is only 71%. So, in other words, the rural consumption is only about 71% lower than the urban expenditure. Typically, at the high end, it used to be 10, 12 years ago, it used to be about 90%. So that's number two. That rural consumption seems to have caught up with urban consumption. The third part is, as you said, in terms of this type of patterns of spends, more on actual necessities. It's difficult to actually understand. If you look at the survey data, also gives class by class, so the poorest, the middle income, and the richest. If you see that, that's another surprise that comes in the survey. That the difference between the least rich, least well off, the poorest, in other words, of families in the rural and urban areas, that seems to be way lower than in the upper income categories. So my sense is, again, I mean, so these are multiple policy implications coming in from this. That how has redistribution over the last 10 years or so played a role in these numbers. We all know the government's focus on providing basic amenities, etc. And this data seems to actually suggest that these interventions have worked very well.
Siddharth, on a tangent really, but related to this, several years ago, as the Chinese economic miracle was being spoken about, one of the things that I recall was the fact that rural China, which also had significant poverty many, many decades ago, started going up in the consumption basket. And the governments there started building a lot of massive infrastructure. Of course, now there is oversupply, but let's leave that aside. Do you see a similar pattern? Because another aspect that the survey focuses on is the fact that, for example, rural spending on food items has declined, which is essentially that once you have enough food, you will obviously go and spend money on other items.
No doubt, Siddharth, there are many encouraging signs in this particular survey that we are talking about today. Uh, it's very clear that rural India is also increasingly getting more and more integrated into with urban India. It's taking place in two, three different ways. One is possibly the physical network connecting rural and urban India. That's possibly creating some new job opportunities, trading opportunities, connectivity, etc., etc. And I think also the telecom and the digital network also is I mean acting on I mean the click economy is also acting as a favorable item over and above the brick economy here. So I think that way the integration is becoming better. And as we discussed earlier also, as you start moving in terms of your per capita income bucket a little higher, then you are a lot more sure about the ticking the box so far as basic necessities are concerned. Then you start investing in some of the long-term aspects, long-term necessities, including very significant investment in education of the future generation. That also over a period of time creates better employability and better prospect for the next generation. I think we have started seeing those benefits in place. I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion about how some of the government induced policies or rather the subsidies in various cash and kind form that goes into the rural economy might have been supporting this number. But I think if we talk only about that will be an unfair way of discussing it. I think the broader momentum is also coming back or coming rather or gathering greater steam with every passing day and with every passing year in case of the rural economy. And that's why in the longer term, it actually gives you more confidence about the momentum and prospect.
I'll come back with a couple of questions on the points that you made. But Saugata, does this data, would this data prompt you to revise the Roti Kapda Makan slogan, which we have all grown up, that this was needed? All of us have added digital to it. We have added mobile to it. So it could be Roti Mobile Makan, or it could be Roti Kapda Makan and mobile. But does this data mean that that slogan needs to be recast? Because it seems to portray a very different picture from those who have been naysayers on India's growth.
It's a very interesting way of framing the question, the basic necessities. Two things. One, on the lower share of food in cereals and food in general in the consumption basket in the rural areas and urban areas. One part that has indubitably played a role in bringing down the share are the free transfers of the transfer subsidies of deliveries of free food grade cereals, rice, wheat, etc. Some pulses. So that has obviously prompted household spending on food to come down. So that's so. I mean, if you're getting free food, you don't have to spend on the market. Your consumption. Because remember, this is an expenditure, consumption expenditure. So that goes out of the consumption expenditure. So that's one explanation for the reduction in food. The interesting part is so in the consumption basket relative to the past 2011-12 basket, the share of food consumption, cereals consumption has come down by 6.5%. That's the fall in food consumption. Where has this been redeployed? Very interestingly, of the other various categories, the biggest increase has been in conveyance. Now, I don't know what this means. Are people traveling more? Are they spending more per kilometer of travel? Is migration patterns changing? What exactly is happening? We need to look at more granular data when it comes out.
And to add, And to add to that, more travel, more resources for travel, more roads, and also cost of travel also perhaps going up.
Yeah.
All of that in the mix, right, Saugata?
Absolutely. So I mean that's you're absolutely right. So what has contributed to this increase in spends on conveyance, as it's called, conveyance meaning transport or whatever travel costs. So that's another thing that means, and it's not just probably the cost of travel; it's also spending on travel, which includes vehicles. Yeah. So I mean, conveyance would include both the hard and the soft aspects of travel. And this is where, in the last couple of years, the role of credit, retail credit, again, as you know, we have discussed this in multiple detail, multiple times. So, how much has this cost of credit, or the conveyance of retail credit, automobile credit, etc., both from banks, NBFCs, and other MFIs and other institutions, how much has that helped in both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the actual vehicles that contribute to the conveyance cost? So that's a very interesting fact that needs to be seen. One more, I mean, finally, a last thing. The difference between the share of in food and other parts in this is how much in the urban and rural areas might urban consumption being fueled by dipping into savings. As you know, I mean, with the past savings numbers that have come in for FY23, the share of financial savings in overall GDP has come down. So is that fueling the urban consumption? Much less in the rural, I'm sure. But how much is the role of a drawdown in savings actually contributing to the increased consumption?
Uh, Saugata, quick follow-up. The Niti Aayog has said, and that's a headline that's all over, that poverty has fallen to 5%. Does this data lead you to a similar conclusion?
I mean, the two sets of data are perfectly consistent. The Niti Aayog's definition of poverty, as you know, is multidimensional poverty, which is not just income, consumption, and savings, which includes five major pillars, including education, etc., access to education, and a whole bunch of health, education, and the others. So that's a more broader measure of poverty. But even beyond that, the work by Dr. Sujit Bhalla and other economists seems to have suggested that the level of absolute poverty has definitely come down. There is no doubt about that in terms of the definition, the World Bank definition of absolute poverty, that has definitely reduced. And this data actually seems to be consistent with that other broader discussion on poverty that's been going on for a while.
Siddharth, do you agree that data can lead us to conclude that poverty has gone down? Because there is another aspect of opinion basis this data, which says that it also leads to a conclusion that the gap between the rich and the poor has widened.
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. This particular survey also clearly showing that the Gini coefficient is actually narrowing, which is actually showing you that in a statistical framework, very clearly the inequality is moving lower. Having said that, you might actually find in instances and anecdotally that some of the gap between rich and poor in certain cases have widened. But even in that case, it's possible the rich has grown at a faster pace. It's not that the poor has gone down. Poor has also gone significantly higher. But that actually puts us in a very interesting situation. That if poor is also moving higher, the future generation is at a more advantageous position. That actually allows him or her to be in a more equitable position to play a catch-up game there after that. Because
so Siddharth, just for the sake of the average viewer, the rich are getting richer, but it doesn't mean that the poor are getting poorer. The poor are perhaps improving a bit. Is that the right way to capture it?
Almost yes. I'd rather say that I'd take the phrase you used a bit. I think the poor is also improving more often than not, quite significantly. So that is a very strong silver line, according to me, and that means that the future generation will be in a slightly more equitable platform, and the future generation might actually play the catch-up game, will be in a better position to play the catch-up game. very interesting point that Saugata has mentioned, that if you see a very significant catch up had or rise had been in case of in case of conveyance. Now conveyance, if you try to see match with some anecdotal data points, the number of persons who from his or her travel from village to town earlier taking only a bus service or a train service, now a lot of them are actually going for his or her own two-wheeler, in many cases his or her own four-wheeler, in many cases a significantly larger number of people are actually taking, say, even for air travel. So all these things, people see the need and the benefit is in terms of getting more connected with the urban areas, and in a cost benefit analysis that they, knowing or with or without knowing it fully, they are doing constantly, and that is giving them the suggesting them that you should go for it, that is actually more beneficial for you. So this is a sign where you actually tend to gain more confidence about the momentum for the economy as a whole.
Saugata, given this data, do you think that the entire inflation, consumer price inflation basket and that framework needs to be relooked at, rejig? There is a exercise and periodical revisions that keep happening, but what kind of impact and usage would this data have for that bit of economic planning?
So first, let me re-emphasize a very important point that Siddharth made in terms of the conveyance, because conveyance, to my mind, equates to opportunity. Travel, conveyance means travel, travel means opportunity. So this is enabling opportunity is a very important point that Siddharth made. So that in terms of your question on the need to recalibrate the CPI weightage basket, that happens automatically, because now there will be a committee that will be formed to revisit the CPI basket. So that will look at the various weights, and these weights are almost automatic. So in terms of the other things. So the other point that we saw in this data is that in the CPI basket in the rural areas, the weight on housing was zero. This one shows that rent is about 6.8% in the rural areas. So that's something that will change probably in the next round of the CPI basket. The important point to know is that given the reduction in the weight of food in both the urban and the rural areas, remember that we have been discussing for the last 6 or 7 months now how volatile headline CPI inflation has become because of the rise and fall of food prices. The first thing that will happen in the next round of the CPI with the new weights that will come in is that this volatility will come down. So it will become a much more stable than what we have seen in the past, and that's good. A stable inflation, even if at high or medium or low levels, whatever.
And that will prevent the likelihood of sort of knee-jerk reactions, both at a fiscal or monetary response. Siddharth, I'm coming to another aspect. In terms of India is clearly one of the largest consumer markets, and this data basically also tells us viewers that India is a consumption nation, and there are 400 to 500 million people who with regard to state-wise, region-wide disparities from this data?
So I think structurally the important point is in many cases, the difference between from state to state in many cases is whether that particular state is more urbanized or not so urbanized. Now, if the gap between urban and rural is getting breached to some extent, that should over a period of time help bridging that state-wise gap also to some extent just by this particular structure. Also, if people are actually, little more mobile within the state, across regions, that also will help bridging that gap. Having said that, while this is a more structural and long-term game, it doesn't happen overnight. At times, even now, opportunities are into bigger cities, etc., etc. So it possibly is a game which will be played out over a more longer period of time. But I think the kind of insights that we are getting from every passing consumer expenditure survey, including this one, it actually tend to make you believe that possibly we are moving more towards it, more opportunities in other places also over a period of time.
And that has consequences for urban India. It has consequences for infrastructure in urban India, healthcare, education, and a host of other features. As we wind down this conversation, quick follow up with you, Shogato. The point that I was discussing with Siddharth, in terms of standard of living, what could you say this survey points towards, that those states which had a lower standard of living are now seeing improvement, and that process will continue?
I think definitely, there is no doubt about that. As Siddharth also mentioned, the rise not just of physical connectivity via roads, rail, etc., the deeper and deeper penetration of digital infrastructure is definitely equating. I mean, this is a huge equalizing force. When people know, learn not just about agricultural prices, etc., to be able to understand, gauge social skills, be in touch with current trends and developments. That actually digital, although I know edtech is now education technology is a little bit under the weather, but the underlying forces are very, very powerful, enabling access to better quality education, better quality healthcare, etc. in this digital infrastructure. Because I think this the convergence of rural and urban India that's very coming out very clearly in this survey. A large part, I'm sure, can be attributed to the digital public infrastructure, other than, of course, the physical infrastructure. And this will only continue. This will only deepen and intensify over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Viewers, economic data it needs careful study. It takes a lot of effort to even gather the data, and much more by professional economists like the ones that you are seeing on your screen right now here with me, to analyze it and draw the right conclusions. This latest survey makes one thing clear. Bharat is moving. It's moving ahead. It is better than where it was 10 years ago. It is certainly going to be much better than where it is today. And the policy response by the states, by the central government, the monetary policy response, all of that will have to take into account this changing pattern of how India spends, and if I can add, how it lives, because how you spend clearly determines the standard of living and your outlook overall towards life. We will try and do a deeper dive again on this, but for now we are completely out of time. I'm going to thank Saugata and Siddharth for their time with us, and you, the viewer, on this episode of Easynomics, where we've tried to deconstruct how India is spending. If you've been, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back with more. Do stay tuned in to Business Today Television. Bye-bye.
Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe from multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines, and many other sectors.